UFC Fight Night Alex Perez versus Tatsuro Taira is taking place this weekend, and in this video I'll be giving you my full predictions for every single fight on the card and all the best moments on the card. Kicking it off with the first fight of Melquizael Costa versus Shayilan Nuerdanbieke. So with these guys, they both have pretty similar UFC runs. I mean, both of them have literally been taken out by Steve Garcia, the exact same fighter. They've both been KO TKO'd by him. However, when you look at those finishes, Melquizael definitely came off worse in that finish than Shayilan Nuerdanbieke did. Shayilan, he got TKO'd like ground and pound after a body shot, and then Costa just took so much damage, blood everywhere. And he had one of those moments where he was literally so out of it, he tried to tackle, I think it was Chris Tognoni. He tried to take Chris Tognoni off his feet thinking that he was Steve Garcia. So yeah, Costa's definitely been the one that's come off worse off out of those fights. But when we look at them specifically, I don't think there is a huge difference in skill sets between the both of them. When you look at the fight, it's going to be a lot of the fights coming up are going to be similar to this in the sense of one of them is more likely to get a KO TKO and the other one is much more likely to get a submission. So Nuerdanbieke in the KO TKO department and then Costa in the submission department. But when you look at the two of them, I think that I'm gonna side with the one that has twice of the amount of experience. He's got the striking accuracy and the strength in the wrestling, and that's Nuerdanbieke, and I think he will get that finish done. I think he'll get a finish late. Melquizael Costa, he does have some pretty decent durability, but he is coming off that bad loss, and Nuerdanbieke has power. So I am gonna favor the underdog in this one. But I think the finish will probably be late, or if Melquizael Costa can somehow hold on, it could possibly be a decision, but I'm more confident in the KO TKO for Shayilan Nuerdanbieke. And when you look at their fights, and in terms of their last fights, Melquizael is literally his last fight with Steve Garcia, and he's coming off that literally end of last year, and it was a brutal loss. So I think when you look at Nuerdanbieke, you know, he's been out for about a year or so, and that's given him a lot more time to, you know, recover, train, and then come back into a fight camp, you know, and then he's pretty much ready for this fight. I think he's more so prepared. And when you're looking at Nuerdanbieke, I mean, he's someone that has just had so much experience, you know, like, and honestly, the experience that he's had is up to par with the fighters that Costa has faced. And when you look at Melquizael Costa, he is dropping down to featherweight, where he does look better in his career, I would say. I think that is an advantage in that sense that Melquizael Costa is dropping down. But if he doesn't get Nuerdanbieke's back, then I think he's done. Because Nuerdanbieke is very, very strong when it comes to the wrestling department, and I think that he will do a good job of out-muscling and out-transitioning Melquizael Costa when it comes to that ground game. I mean, it could be completely wrong, just depending on how Costa's weight cut goes, but I am much more favored into the side of Nuerdanbieke when it comes to the experience, the KO power there, the strength in the wrestling department, and he ultimately, if they're trading on the feet, he has the better power, and I think he'll get the finish in this one. Moving on to Josefine Knutsson versus Julia Polastri. Now, Polastri, she does have some promise at the moment. She is #1 ranked pound for pound in Brazil, at least that's what it states on Tapology, and that's to clarify, that is her in her country of Brazil. That is not out of all Brazilian fighters. So she is #1 within her actual country. That's not including, you know, Brazilian fighters in the actual UFC. So, you know, take that with a grain of salt, but she does have the reach advantage in this fight, and she has never been finished. And when you look at her first trial on Dana White's Contender Series, she fought at flyweight, and she fought Jasmine Jasudavicius, who is, well, especially now, she's looking very decent. And she was way bigger than Julia Polastri in their fight. And she has not lost since then. She has gone 4-0, and she is now at strawweight. So she's more at the weight that she should be at. She's almost basically an atomweight. You know, strawweight's definitely a whole lot better than flyweight. But when you look at her skill set, her striking defense and her head movement in both her Dana White's Contender Series fights have been pretty piss poor. And especially in her last fight against Alujas, which was in Dana White's Contender Series. And look, she won, but when you're fighting someone like Knutsson, who is very technically sound on the feet, and she has the speed, I think that is where that issue is really going to become prevalent in this fight. And I don't see that she is going to get a lot of success, especially when it comes to a points basis. When it comes to that end of the fight, I just don't see, you know, her staying on the feet. I don't see that that's where she's going to win this fight. I see that Knutsson doesn't have the power, but she's got the accuracy, she's got the technical capability there, and especially, most importantly, she's got the speed against someone that barely has any head movement. So I think that Knutsson has an extremely big advantage here when it comes to the feet, and she also has very good ground transitions. Now, Knutsson, honestly, she hasn't really fought anyone of note, but I would say that with Polastri as well, aside from Judice. And, you know, I mean, Knutsson fought Marnik Man in her last fight, and honestly, Marnik Man's a can, to be honest. And Polastri, when it comes to the ground game, Polastri, she has 3 submission finishes, but she doesn't have any off her back. And I don't think she has a huge threat overall anyway on her back. When you look at the times when she has fought and she is on her back, there's nothing really going on there. She kind of just drags it out until the round's over. And if you're someone like Knutsson, who has pretty decent transitional awareness, good movement when it comes to the ground game, I think she can honestly get the better there as well. The only difference I'd say here is when it comes to that power, I think Polastri does have that shot to, you know, do some actual damage on the feet if she pressures forward. But if, you know, with Knutsson's speed, her technical capabilities, and if she's prepared, I don't see Knutsson having a huge problem here. With that being said, I'm going to give Knutsson the decision in this one. I just don't see, aside from Polastri getting that finish with that power, or maybe being on top, I just don't see her being able to get Knutsson out of there. And I simply see Knutsson just outpointing her on the feet in this one, to be honest. Moving up to Jeka Saragih versus Weston Wilson. Now, Weston Wilson, he does have a submission threat there, and he does have the reach advantage, and he's got a karate style base. I wouldn't say, you know, I don't think he's been too impressive on the feet, but I mean, when you are someone that has longer leg reach, longer reach as well, and is a karate style fighter, that lead leg can do some damage and cause some problems. But when you look at Weston Wilson's form, he has been absolutely destroyed in his last 2 fights by Gene Silva and Joe Anderson Brito, who are definitely more so tough competition, and they're better than Jeka Saragih, I'll say that. But Jeka Saragih, stylistically, like those guys, he is another power puncher that will be able to test Weston Wilson's chin, which I don't think is there anymore. I think Saragih, when you look at him, he does struggle with range. We've seen that in the past couple fights, but it just depends if Wilson can actually utilize it or not. Wilson, he does have the threat on the ground, but when you look at Saragih, he has a pistol of a right hand. If you look, I believe it was like 2 fights before the road to UFC final, he fought a Korean guy, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but absolutely flatlined him. And honestly, it didn't even look like he generated a lot on that as well. He just flung it out and gone. So I think if you put Weston Wilson in front of that punch, Weston Wilson's getting folded like an absolute lawn chair. So I do have Jeka Saragih in this fight, winning by KO TKO. Probably in the 1st or 2nd round. Moving on to Carli Judice versus Gabriella Fernandes. Now, when we look at Judice, she has a very high output. She fought Garrett Skater in Dana White's Contender Series. If you haven't seen that, I mean, it's not very technical, but the sheer volume of that fight was very impressive. And she did lose that fight, but it did show aspects of her game. She does have a very good gas tank on her. She held up quite well. She's got the chin at least. While she is early in her career, she's only 3-1. So we don't know how much that chin's actually been tested. But when you compare her to Gabriella Fernandes, Fernandes has fought over twice as much as her. She's only lost to decent competition. Again, Jasmine Jasudavicius. She lost to Jasmine Jasudavicius and Teresa Blader. Now, Teresa Blader isn't really a big fighter or anything like that, but Teresa Blader has only lost to Natalia Silva, and Natalia Silva is definitely a problem in the flyweight division. And Fernandes has shown both striking and grappling threats. She's got that well-rounded capability, and that coming against someone that does not have the experience there is definitely going to be an issue for Carli Judice. And Fernandes, on top of that, she has pretty composed kickboxing. And I do think that Judice is durable enough to hold out for a decision, but I've definitely got Fernandes taking this decision. And I think it'll mainly be by chewing up the legs and making Judice just very immobile. I just don't think she'll be able to get a lot of movement off, especially if Fernandes gets those leg kicks off in the first round. And Gabriella Fernandes is a decent counter striker as well. So if she is able to forward pressure with the jab and then, disrupt Judice's forward pressure herself and then, counter when Judice comes in, then I think that she will do a very good job of getting that decision pretty decisively. And Judice doesn't have great head movement either. She does rely pretty heavily on that durability. And yeah, I just don't think she's found her best key to victory in her game yet. And I think Gabriella Fernandes has, so I've got her taking this by decision. Moving on to Josh Quinlan versus Adam Fugitt. Now, this one is definitely a tricky one to predict. Both of them are coming off losses, and Fugitt is pushing out of his prime age range. He's 35 now. But we have seen Quinlan struggle against rangier fighters like Danny Barlow and Trey Waters, and Fugitt is one of those guys. He has a 5-inch reach advantage over Quinlan. Fugitt does have a pretty well-rounded skill set with the takedowns and the top control that he can implement in his game. And not to mention as well, when it comes to their opposition, Adam Fugitt has fought Michael Morales, and Michael Morales is an undefeated up-and-comer, very young. He's got a lot of hype around him. I believe he's coming out of Ecuador, so he's got a chin. I mean, if it's anything to take from Marlon Vera. And yeah, he's just a very, very composed fighter, very good with his straight shots, very lengthy as well. And Adam Fugitt was making that fight very, very competitive, especially through that first and part of the second round until he obviously got finished. But that was a very competitive fight through those early rounds. And I think comparing him to that and then fighting Josh Quinlan, I think he's going to have a better time against Josh Quinlan. And when we look at Quinlan, he hasn't really fought anyone of the same caliber except for Danny Barlow. I will say Quinlan does have a pretty decent chin, and he's fairly well-rounded himself. I would probably give him the grappling advantage in terms of the offensive submission threat. But on the feet, Quinlan has a seriously bad knack of absorbing strikes in his fights that he realistically does not need to absorb. And now, again, another one on this card that does not have great head movement. He has almost averaged a strike absorption rate of 7 strikes per minute. So that is 7 strikes per minute is honestly a lot higher than most of the UFC fighters on the roster. So he has absorbed a lot in the time that he has been fighting in the UFC. But I think with that chin that he has, I'm going to take Fugitt by decision here. I just don't think Fugitt will be able to get that finish off, but I think he'll be able to pour on some damage in this one. Moving on to Jimmy Flick versus Nate Maness. As happy as I am for getting the prediction for Flick submitting Malcolm Gordon right in his last fight, I'm very happy for Jimmy Flick, but I honestly just do not like his chances in this fight really at all. He's built for just grappling. I think that he's just built for just a jiu-jitsu based fighter. He should just be doing jiu-jitsu. I don't think he should have any form of striking in his game, in terms of a career. I honestly think that, especially going up against Nate Maness, who is just levels above him in the MMA space overall. I mean, he's won every single fight he's had in the UFC aside from Tagir Ulanbekov, who we'll get to later in the card, and Umar Nurmagomedov. And then he's just got one loss in his career early on to Taylor Lapulus. So all three of them are absolutely no joke. So
You know, like Jimmy Flick's record just speaks for itself. You know, he's 15-0 with submissions. He's an absolute wizard there. Hence why I think he should just be doing grappling. But he's 0-6 when it comes to defeat. When it comes to, you know, the striking aspect of MMA, you know, he does not have a chin. And going against someone like Nate Maness, who just tore up Mateus Mendonca in his last fight, there's just no other way, I think, than Nate Maness getting the KO TKO win. I think he's going to chin Jimmy Flick, and I don't really see this going any other way unless Flick can somehow get the ground advantage somewhere. But I don't see it happening. Nate Maness has, you know, fought enough. He's experienced enough to know that, okay, I'm not going to play into this guy's game when he's an absolute wizard on the ground. Hopefully he's not idiotic enough to do that. And that being said, I don't see it happening, to be honest. And I do think that Maness is going to chin him, and even more insult to injury. Maness is extremely accurate with his striking. He's got a 75% clip on his striking and has the KO power capability on top of that. So I think he finishes this one in the first round.
Moving up to Tagir Ulanbekov versus Josh Van. Now, this fight is definitely one of the fights I'm most excited for. I thought this would be on the main card, or at least the feature prelim. I mean, you look at Van, he's got a lot of hype at the moment. He's definitely has a lot of promise, especially on the feet. He's got very crisp boxing. He utilizes his jab very well. I think he will do good in the flyweight division, but I just think that this fight I think this is a bit too premature for him. And I think stylistically, this isn't what he wants. When you look at Tagir Ulanbekov, I think that he's just a bit too much of a tough test for him. I mean, you've got Ulanbekov, who is very well rounded. I mean, he doesn't have the KO power, but he's got the 5-inch reach advantage. He's got a 4-inch leg reach advantage, and he is very good at popping the jab. And when you have a 5-inch reach advantage, that is going to cause problems for even someone like Joshua Van, who is an advanced striker. They both are very accurate. They both have 55% clips in their striking, but I will edge the striking to Josh Van. But the main issue that we just simply have to point out in this fight is the ground game. The ground game, 100%. I just think that Tagir will use that Sambo base to his, you know, absolute best advantage he can, and I think that he'll be able to grind Joshua Van out. I think he'll take the opportunities away from Van when it comes to that striking aspect. I think the moment that Joshua Van starts trying to find some rhythm, Tagir will shoot straight away. And that is what he needs to do. And you look at that comparison, I mean, Joshua Van, if you were to put Joshua Van against like Cody Durden's wrestling, I think he would still be able to take Joshua Van down and, you know, handle him pretty decently. But then you look at Tagir. Tagir was able to manhandle Cody Durden, and Cody Durden is a good wrestler. So you look at that aspect, and I just don't see how Van is going to keep up with that wrestling pace and that transitional capability of Tagir Ulanbekov. But I don't think Tagir will aggressively push for the submission, just in case he does give up that control and then allows Josh Van to get up to the feet. So I do think that he will grind out Joshua Van in this one. But that being said, I think Joshua Van will lose, but I think he'll come back. I think he'll come back and he'll get into the rankings at some point, but I do not think that this is the fight to do it. Moving up to our feature prelim, Brady Hiestand versus Garrett Armfield. Both of these guys have had pretty decent starts in their UFC careers so far, but after the Katona fight at UFC 297, I think that Armfield is my more confident pick here. He's undefeated at bantamweight and utilizes his jab very well. Yes, he doesn't have the reach advantage in this fight, but from what I've seen, I think that he is more confident on the feet than Brady Hiestand is, and I think he'll be able to utilize that jab to his advantage and time it a lot better than Hiestand will be able to. And Garrett Armfield has fought better opponents too. He's fought tougher opponents. He's fought Brad Katona. He's fought David Onama up at featherweight, and he mixes up his striking very well, especially just, you know, leading off that jab. And I think
I do think that he'll be able to outwork Hiestand on the feet fairly comfortably. I mean, he lands at a very high output. I mean, he lands at almost 7 strikes per minute compared to Hiestand. Hiestand only lands about 3 strikes per minute. So he's a lot more active. You know, he's got I think he's just got that confidence in the UFC. And I think that he is just going to be able to take that on the feet. Now, Hiestand, he does have the wrestling and submission threat there. But I think that Armfield has pretty underrated takedown defense. He's got the stats say about 64 to 65% in terms of his takedown defense. But honestly, when it comes to the specific opponents that he has faced and their takedown threat, like you look at Brad Katona is someone that does love the ground game, utilizing that top control ground and pound. He struggled extremely hard to get Armfield down. And Armfield, after that experience, is only getting better. So I think it's going to make it very difficult for Hiestand to actually get him to the ground. I mean, you look at that Katona fight, he stuffed over half of his takedown attempts. So I think Hiestand's going to struggle in this fight, to be honest. And Hiestand is big for the division. And yes, I understand he has the reach edge, but he is still young into his career. And Armfield ultimately just better at mixing up the strikes, utilizing the forward pressure. He's better than any fighter that Brady Hiestand has actually fought. So I'm just going to have to give Armfield the decision in this one. Moving on to the main card, Almabayev versus Jose Johnson. Now, Almabayev, he has that classic from the mountains, let me grind you out for 15 minutes kind of style. You know, he's very good at applying pressure and is very good at chain wrestling, similar to Khamzat Chimaev in the way that he fights. But he's just the size of like Khamzat's, you know, right leg. He's tiny. But that doesn't take away from his skill set and the fighter that he's facing. And look, Jose Johnson, he is big. He is big for flyweight. I just don't know how he's making this weight. But honestly, it's hard to take away from Almabayev winning this fight. He's on a 15-fight win streak, has a lot of momentum, and I do have him taking this fight, honestly, especially with the way he times his takedowns and the success he has with the submissions. And as you can see on the screen, 3 and 4 with submissions. Jose Johnson, that's not the best part of his game. He's more of a KO threat. But I would not be surprised when I say that if Jose Johnson can spark Almabayev out on the feet, especially if Almabayev comes in too aggressively. His striking defense, when he comes in aggressively for striking exchanges, is not great. When he fought CJ Vergara was catching him a lot of times when he was trying to enter. And if you're doing that against Jose Johnson over CJ Vergara and they're having the same success, I'm not going to be surprised if Johnson can sleep him there. Aside from the KO power, you know, he's got the reach. So, I mean, if he can use a technically sound game, utilize the jab there, then he has a chance. But I do think that weight cut that Johnson's going to be doing, it's going to be rough. I just don't see how this is going to benefit him moving down to this division. I honestly think that he is going to struggle, and I think a big part of it is that it's going to drain his cardio and it could affect his chin too. Now, I'm not too worried about the KO TKO from Almabayev unless it's on the ground, but the cardio is where the issue is against someone that has Almabayev's type of game. You do not want to be losing your stamina against someone like him, against obviously someone like Khamzat Chimaev, you know, and with this weight cut, I think it could definitely happen. And honestly, I do see Almabayev taking this one by a second round or possibly third round submission, and I think it's going to be a rear naked choke. Almabayev has very versatile chokes. He's got a number of them in his record, and Jose Johnson is susceptible to those chokes. So I think I'm predicting here, I think he is going to get that rear naked choke win. Moving up to Douglas Silva de Andrade versus Miles Johns. Douglas Silva is definitely, he's one of those ones that is really tricky and hard to predict who's going to win when he's fighting whoever he's going to fight. He's very similar to Eliseo Zaleski dos Santos in that, you know, he's almost 40 years old, but he's only ever been finished twice in his career. And I mean, he's had 30 odd fights, 34 fights in his career. And he's only been finished twice, and he's 38 years old. You know, that is pretty impressive, and that's similar to Eliseo Zaleski dos Santos. When you look at him, the only two that could finish him were Petr Yan by KO TKO and Rob Font by submission, which definitely says something about his defensive capability and the experience that he has in the fighters that he's fought. You just can't forget to mention he's a finishing machine. He's got 22 finishes in 29 fights, with 20 of them being by KO TKO. But when we look at Miles Johns, he is pretty vicious with his boxing combinations. And has the KO power there too. And I think I'm just going to edge this to Johns in this fight, more so due to him being more defensively sound on the feet. I mean, he absorbs under 3 strikes per minute on average and has the wrestling threat there. But I do think the odds are I do think they're fair, to be honest. I think there's going to be an extremely close fight. I don't think they should be, pushed one way over the other. But I do think that one of them could definitely sleep the other. But Johns, I've got him by decision. But Johns is in his prime age. He has very good striking defense, and he has a wrestling game. He actually has decent takedowns, good control on the ground, and I think he can use that as a safety net if Douglas Silva does start to forward pressure and get aggressive. Because Douglas Silva, yes, he's 38, but he's got speed, he's got KO power, and that's something that Miles Johns just does not want to deal with, even though especially with the reach, even though it's just 2.5 inches, that can still make or break it, especially in a fight like this if they're both on the feet. And I do think if he does, which I hopefully think he will implement that wrestling game and hopefully drag out a decision. Because Douglas Silva is one of those fighters. He has those. He's like Tyron Woodley in that sense, but obviously not from a wrestling background. He's one of those very sturdy fighters. Got a lot of like explosive muscle fibers and everything. So they have a lot of explosive capabilities early on in the fight, but then they start to wane later in the fight. And I think that Miles Johns, if he can use that wrestling, then he has that ability to wear Douglas Silva down, possibly to the point where he doesn't have that KO power. And you line that up with the striking defense of Miles Johns, I am going to take him by decision in this one if all of that does go to plan. So I'm saying it does, and that's what I'm going with. Moving on to Timmy Kwamba versus Lucas Almeida. Now, Lucas Almeida, got to give it to him. He is a finishing machine. He has finished every single one of his wins by stoppage. He has lost one decision, but I mean, you've got to respect him there in terms of the picks. He is a threat, whether it comes to the submissions, whether it comes to the feet. But that being said, he has dipped pretty hard in form recently. He's lost 3 of his last 5 fights, with 2 of those losses being by finishes, and they're the only finish losses he has in his career. And then when we look at Timmy Kwamba is, he's young, he's hungry, and he's got very good finishing potential on the feet. And if it comes to the ground game and it comes to that offensive submission game, I've got Lucas Almeida all day. Obviously, you can see on the screen from the stats, Timmy Kwamba 0-1 when it comes to submissions. But he does have decent wrestling, especially against the cage. And I think that there is a bit to take away from his last fight against Oki in the UFC. He was fighting on a week's notice max, and he fought literally 9 days after KOing Michael Stack on the regional scene. And he was at lightweight against Oki, which isn't his natural weight class. Featherweight's his natural weight class. And even at lightweight, he looked very, very fast with his hands. He was catching Oki out a couple times. You compare that to him now being at featherweight, most likely faster, and has a full training camp. I honestly think that speed is going to get it done for him by a KO TKO finish in this one, especially if Almeida comes out sluggish and stiff like he did against Andre Fili in their fight. So ultimately, I do have Kwamba in this one, but that being said, though, it could easily happen with it, Lucas Almeida and his experience and his finish potential, but I'm basing it off that recent form, and I do think Timmy Kwamba is going to get this one done by a finish. Moving up to Ikram Aliskerov versus Antonio Trocoli. Fairly plain and simple here, honestly. I've got Ikram Aliskerov, and I think he's going to get it done by KO. Trocoli, I don't think he's looked super impressive overall in his last few fights. Yes, he's won, but he just doesn't look very fast. He looks fairly sluggish, and he is very long and tall and just big for the middleweight division, which I think when you're going against someone like Aliskerov, very similar to Jose Johnson against Asu Almabayev, when you're weight cutting and you're that heavy, I think that is going to have some compromising factors to his chin and his cardio. And having that against anyone is an issue, but against Ikram Aliskerov with that KO power and that finishing threat, I think this is a recipe for disaster for him, to be honest. When you look at his career, when you look at Trocoli's career, all 3 of his losses in his career have either been with him at middleweight or welterweight. I don't know how the hell he makes welterweight, but yeah, you look at that, you look at through his career, all of his losses, those 3 losses have been at middleweight or welterweight. He should be at light heavyweight. And I think that pure power that Ikram Aliskerov generates, and just that KO threat, that finishing threat, I think he is going to absolutely chin Trocoli. Unless Trocoli can do some absolute magic on the ground, he's 5-0 with submissions. But on top of that, you know, even more damage to Trocoli. Trocoli is coming in on short notice. I mean, he is taking the fight after Andre Muniz pulled out, who was going to be fighting Aliskerov. So Aliskerov he's got the full training camp here. Trocoli is the one that's coming in on short notice, and he would already have been the underdog anyway. I mean, Aliskerov is a finishing machine. And, you know, Aliskerov is the only person he's lost to is Khamzat Chimaev. So it shows the levels there. And honestly, I think even when it comes to the ground game, I honestly think Aliskerov can possibly bully him at that stage, especially if he can drag him out and get Trocoli tired with that weight cut. So ultimately, I've got Ikram Aliskerov just absolutely chinning him in the first round. Moving on to the main event, Alex Perez versus Tatsuro Taira. This fight is honestly is probably the best outcome in terms of a reward for Tatsuro Taira, because he's only just got into the rankings, and now with the, you know, the fight breakdowns that he's had in terms of when you're supposed to fight Tim Elliott, and he's supposed to fight Joshua Van, I believe, as well. I mean, now he gets Alex Perez, and Alex Perez is ranked number 5 compared to number 13. You know, this is a huge opportunity for Tatsuro Taira. If he gets this win, he's literally in the top 5 of the rankings, and he's 24 years old. And, you know, having that potential to enter there is going to make him extreme. I think he's going to be extremely hungry, extremely focused for this fight. But with that being said, Perez is ranked number 5 for a reason. He's fought pretty much all the top competition at flyweight across the years. Those flyweights that he has fought have posed a much bigger threat than Taira has, you know, and compared to their games. You know, Taira is good, but I mean, compared to Davison Figueiredo, you know, Alexandre Pantoja, it's a different game. And yes, Alex Perez lost to them, but, you know, he's just coming off a KO win of Mateus Nicolau. He absolutely chinned him less than 2 months ago. And that being said, less than 2 months ago, Alex Perez has been in camp this whole entire time. Like, there's no way he hasn't. You know, he's 100% ready to go. He's been wanting to be active ever since he chinned Nicolau, because you can understand why. It's his frustration. I mean, he's had about 48,000 fight cancellations. So, you know, Alex Perez is probably very hungry as well. And I mean, he's in his prime age range. He's 32 years old. And with his boxing, if he can keep that boxing form that he used against Mateus Nicolau, he could honestly take Taira out. I think he could KO Taira. And Taira has been wobbled in the UFC before. When he fought Carlos Fernandes in the first round, he got wobbled straight away. So if Alex Perez is touching him like Carlos Fernandes did, and Alex Perez got that power that he used against Nicolau, he could chin him 100%. But as good as Perez is on the feet, his submission defense is notoriously questionable. His wrestling is decent, don't get me wrong, but his submission defense specifically is not that great. And when you look at that, when you look at the fight stylistically, the submission offensive threat is the biggest part of Taira's game. It's the biggest weapon in his arsenal. He has 6 first-round submissions, and he's basically a more offensive-oriented Muhammad Mokaev. Mokaev is more of like a control-based fighter, but Tatsuro Taira has very good wrestling, And he's got that submission offensive threat, which is Alex Perez's Achilles heel. I cannot stop saying Alex Pereira for some reason. And honestly, with that, I think Taira is going to get this to the ground at some point, or at least drag it out for a while. And I think in the 25 minutes that they do have, I think he is going to find the submission in this fight. And I think it's going to be by some form of choke. If Perez can drag it through the later rounds or keep it on the feet, then he definitely has the advantage. And by no way, shape or form, I don't think that he has no possibility of absolutely chinning him. He definitely could. But overall, when it comes to the game, I am leaning towards Tatsuro Taira. I mean, he can utilize the jab. I mean, he's got KOs. I mean, he's 4-0 with KOs, so he's a very well-rounded fighter. And he's got the 4.5 reach inch advantage. So, if he can keep Perez at bay on the feet, touch him up on the feet, find those takedowns, find the submission opportunities, I do think he's going to take this fight. And I do think that he is going to get that submission win in this one. Moving on to the fight card awards, kicking it off with fight of the night, Tagir Ulanbekov versus Joshua Van. This is just an extremely technical fight. I wish it was higher up on the card. I think it should be higher up on the card. Honestly, I think this fight could almost be co-main event, to be honest. And when you look at them, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how Van can adapt to the ground game and that overall just challenge of Tagir Ulanbekov being in the top 15. It's a very big step up in competition compared to the fighters that he's fought, like Borjas. And I honestly, I think it's going to be a struggle for him, but if he can do it, it's going to be absolutely huge for him. And yeah, that would be a statement win to get into the top 15. Now, moving to performance of the night, I'm giving it to Ikram Aliskerov. I think Ikram is just going to cement himself further to the point that he is going to have to get a top 15 shot. And Antonio Trocoli is just not going to be the one to stop the hype train, and I think he's going to get brutally chinned. Now, moving to fighter to watch, I'm giving it to Jeka Saragih. I think Saragih has pretty much the perfect opportunity in this fight to put his country on notice even further by taking out Weston Wilson. And it will be good to see if he has to face adversity with both the reach and the submission style of Weston Wilson. So it's an interesting matchup, but I think it's that opportunity with the power that he has. I think that right hand's going to land and it's going to decapitate Weston Wilson. Now, moving to finish of the night, I'm giving it to Nate Maness. Just like Saragih, perfect opportunity for him. I think he's going to get a highlight reel finish here. I think he's definitely better than Malcolm Gordon and definitely better than Jimmy Flick on the feet. And if he keeps this fight on the feet, I think he could honestly just steal that finish of the night on this card. If you've enjoyed this video and you want to see more MMA-based content, just click here on the screen for the UFC 302 recap video where I talk about the entire fight of Islam Makhachev versus Dustin Poirier in their title fight and all the fights before it on the UFC 302 card. And with that being said, please like, comment, subscribe, and I will catch you in the next one.